welcome everybody to Hunting for Consensus. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging of the Turrbal and the Jagera people. And you're all aware that we're here to find consensus on climate change and decarbonisation, but we're going to do that in a very structured way. And so firstly, I'd like to introduce the panelists. So from the LNP or the Liberal Nationalist Society at UQ, we have Julia Bejleri and Carson Duval. From the ALP club at UQ, we have Max Thompson and Carib Phillips. And from the UQ Greens, we have Tyson Leon Cusack, and we have Josh Ryan. So, and also my name is Kyle. I'm from the Student Energy Network here at UQ. I'll be the moderator, and this is Sophie. She'll be timekeeper. So, next thing I was going to go through was the premise and the goals of the night. And so the premise, I think we at UQ SEN approach this, these three clubs with the belief that generally the topic of climate change and decarbonisation has become very convoluted with misinformation, partisanship and short-termism, which can only harm us in the long run, and that we as students might be able to make some attempt to correct the narrative right here. And by agreeing to take part in this event and actively working with SEN over the past few months, these clubs have showed not just their willingness, but their enthusiasm to actually help with that mission, to do the homework necessary and actually have an informed discussion. And to steer clear from that classic debate format as much as possible. And so we've all agreed to the following goals for the night. And that is first and foremost to find where consensus lies in these issues and in our views and in our reasoning. But second, to engage in thoughtful discussion and exchange of information. And third, to respectfully yet clearly establish where disagreement lies and then to move on. The structure, we've broken it down into 4 key issues, which we expect to find consensus on quite easily in the beginning, but as we progress through, we expect consensus to become something more that we should try for. And, there we go. And so for each one of those questions, I'll go through and I'll briefly explain a bit of context and some information which might help for anyone who hasn't spent, for instance, the last few months preparing for this event. Those 4 questions are on climate change being human-caused, climate change as a threat, as a role, or Australia's role, and our path to decarbonisation. And to ensure quality discussion, we've all agreed to an immunity mechanism. So that's where each question will be put to each club, and I'll tell you the amount of time that club has to answer, and within that time, there'll be a few minutes for immunity where clubs can't interject and ask questions, and neither can I, but after that immunity is over, Sophie will ring her bell, and then other clubs and myself can butt in to ask questions or to raise things with those goals in mind. So, last 2 things to talk about is the sponsor for tonight, and that is the UQ Centre of Natural Gas and their Director, Professor Andrew Garnett, for providing the funds and the guidance to make this possible. And finally, I guess just a quick plug to our merchandise. After this event, SEN makes some very beautiful shirts and some socks if you would be interested after the discussion. So, let's get onto it. On question 1, so this topic of climate change being human-caused. The context that I have for this is that in October 2021, the IPCC released their 6th assessment report on the physical science basis for climate change. Over the decades since their report, their first one, in 1990, we've seen massive increase in technology for climate modelling and our own understanding. And this is the clearest picture yet given in the most recent report, given by these 2 graphs here. And on the right is the most clearest. As you can see, since 1850 is what we have predicted through our modelling and through our simulation to have happened without any human interference versus with human interference with confidence intervals included. And you can see that those confidence intervals align or they overlap until 2000, but after that they don't overlap at all. And you can also see that in the black line of that graph is the actual temperature increase of the globe, and it lines up quite nicely with the human interference prediction. And so that's the end of the context that I have to give. So now the question that I will ask the panelists is there any room for debate on climate change being human-caused after you've seen that, or to what degree humans are causing it? And so for this question, I've allotted 1 minute for an answer, And none of that, or all of that comes under immunity. So I'd like to ask firstly the Greens.
Excellent question, Kaya. So short answer, no. The conception of climate science and the debate around humans influencing the Earth's climate has existed since the late 19th century, and over that period, 99% of scientific papers have reached the same conclusion, and with this overwhelming scientific consensus. Really, we're past the stage of debating the existence of climate change and the cause, and we really should be focusing on how and when to transition to a decarbonised society. On the point of to what degree humans are causing it, it's important that a debate around this isn't used as an excuse to delay action. Science is pretty clear. We know 0.8 to 1.3 degrees of the warming we've experienced so far is the net result of humans, and we also know that the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions is the burning of fossil fuels.
Great, thanks Tyson. And now I will pass it on to the ALP.
Yeah, same answer. In short, no. I don't think there really is any debate within the political sphere to see if it's anthropogenic or not. The science has been really clear for the last few decades that it is human caused, and there's really no question about that. The threats that we're getting from this is we're going to have more severe droughts, harder cyclones. I don't think there's really any need to debate if it's caused by humans or not, because it really isn't. We need to focus on how to mitigate it at this point. But in saying that, that's within the political sphere. Within the scientific sphere, there's always you need to have rigorous testing and rigorous questioning. That's how scientific method works. But within the context of this panel, I don't think there's any need to question if it's anthropogenic or not.
Great, all right, thank you, Carol. And finally, I'd like to ask the LNP.
I think from an objective perspective, we also agree there isn't much space for debate here. In terms of what we do get, so the latest IPCC reports have recommended net zero by 2050, and that's obviously the policies that we're all working towards. There is obviously also a degree of uncertainty in climate modelling, but regardless, we do agree that in the long term, we see climate change as an opportunity for us to bolster our economy and bolster the amount of innovation that we have in our industries. But yeah, in terms of whether it's caused by humans, we do definitely agree that there is some kind of contribution there that's anthropogenic, and yeah, there's definitely consensus to start off with there, so yeah.
Okay, so all's looking good so far. Now, we would like to move on to question 2. So this is where we expect to get a little bit more conflicting ideas and a little bit harder to get consensus on. So climate change as a threat. This topic has been designed as a context to the rest of the discussion. Because when we come to talk about Australia's role compared to the rest of the world and how we compare ourselves or how we are supposed to overcome this challenge, it's important for us to know the stakes of the game. The International Energy Agency has modelled 4 global scenarios, as you'll see on that left side. You can see the graph it goes out to 2100, and that's a picture of the temperature. So the green line, or the light green line on the bottom there, is a rapid switch to net zero by 2050 worldwide, and then becoming significantly net negative afterwards. Whereas you can see the top of that line, the opposite, as you could say, is if every country in the world followed what is currently in their policies right now. And you can see the difference by 2050 is that all of these countries following their stated policies, we reach 2 degrees by 2050 versus complete rapid switch to net zero. Then we still elapse 1.5 and we get back down to 1.5 around 2055 or something like that. And so the stakes that we've established, or what does that extra 1.5 mean? There could be an extra 1.5 or an extra 1 degree if we fail, basically. And so, when we think about the IPCC assessments and what they say the difference between 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees is examples such as an additional 30 to 90% likelihood of extreme temperature events. For instance, 41 or 43 degrees in Brisbane, or an additional 15% likelihood of extreme rainfall events, and 100% more direct flooding damage in wet areas, 20% likelihood of severe droughts in dry areas, 4% of species additional at very high risk of extinction, 20% of the current population exposed to extreme coastal flooding, and well, that's all just to name a few. And so when we talk about this, or we go on to talk about it later, it's very important to remember that's additional to the 1.5. That's basically if we fail to go as fast as we'd like to. And to balance that with the cost of decarbonising. So now I'll let the panelists discuss. So the question or the wording that I'd like, or that we've considered, is what do we have to consider to establish an appropriate timeline of decarbonisation? For example, the impacts that I just kind of talked about, but also the rate of technological and research advancement, how fast we can actually deploy infrastructure, when we should be net zero, or like what our 2030 goals may be, although we'll cover that further in question 4. But then also, we're currently on a path to exceed that 1.5, as I said before. So where should our efforts lie in between mitigation and adaptation? And finally, are we currently taking proportional action? So for this question, I've allotted 5 minutes for this question and 3 minutes within immunity. So I'd like to put this first to the LNP Club to start us off with that.
Perfect. Thanks, Kyle. So in terms of creating an appropriate timeline for decarbonisation, the LNP sees the impacts of climate change as the starting point, but the rate of technological research and advancement is also something that's very important. In terms of how we can deploy specific infrastructure, so the amount of time that we'll need to deploy hydrogen, whether that's underground or more solar and wind systems as well. It's very much a question of is it feasible economically but also physically for us to deploy this infrastructure? When we should be net zero, so the 2050 goal obviously comes from the Paris Agreement, and that's something that we've agreed to, and we are working towards through industry and international collaboration. In terms of when to reach net negative, that's also something there to consider. And just ensuring that we keep with those global agreements, that's definitely something that's very important to establishing that timeline. So I'll just pass it on to Carsten.
I'd say in regarding the balance between mitigation and adaptation, we really need a common sense approach with these things. We need to build the infrastructure to help mitigate the short-term effects, so things like more severe droughts and floods. I know that the Morrison government made a $7.4 billion investment in making more dams and water projects. So that would be a short-term response to it that we need to help, regional resilience, to make sure that our agricultural industry is protected as we begin the trek towards net zero. But we also really need to put a focus on our long-term commitments. So things like making, smart investments in the right industry, investing in technology to help us, bridge that gap and go right up towards net zero 2050. And I do think that we are currently taking action that's proportional to the risks. The Morrison government's making exemplary investments in the right circumstances, in the right industries. They've invested around $35 billion in renewable energy since 2017. And as the Australia's long-term emission reduction plan outlines, there's another $20 billion in there as we head towards 2030. But it's smart investments that are going to take us there. So that's going to help us with our long-term goals and being able to build that infrastructure and take the appropriate action to mitigate the short-term consequences of climate change.
I'll ask a question, and that would be like, so what exactly do the investments in adaptation, adaptation in terms of getting used to the effects, such as droughts and all that kind of stuff. Would you be able to give us maybe just like an idea of what that may look like, adapting to these kind of effects?
So yeah, like I said, with the investment in regional resilience, a lot of the effects of climate change that we feel happen in the regions. farmers' crops are coming in earlier, there's more severe weather events that farmers have to deal with. And the thing that we are doing and we could do more is making the investments in the regions to make sure that the resilience is increased, to make sure that they're better equipped to handle the environment as it changes. That would be a major part of it, but it's all along strategic investment in the right places to make sure that we are resilient as we experience increased effects of environmental changes. But the agricultural industry is a big part of this, and I think that it definitely is rightly so a big focus of Morrison's investment plan.
Well, if there's no further questions from other panelists, then I'll chuck this on to ALP.
We've recognised that over the next 20 years, the global temperature is likely to reach or exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius. Okay? Our plan there's three possible scenarios that could take place, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Physical Base of Science report published in 2021. The most unlikely plan, yet we've still enabled to plan for it through the Labor Environmental Action Network, is a scenario where by 2100 there's a 0.84 metre elevation in the sea levels due to this. Okay? The more likely scenarios to take place with climate change are scenarios 3 to 4.5 in the Physical Science report, and they outline a possible increase of 0.44 metres to 0.76 metre elevation in the oceans by 2100. Now, the LNP will sit here and, walk you through some sort of scenarios outlining targets and what have you. The Labor Party has a plan to legislate action on climate change. The effects of climate change by 2100, given the most likely scenarios, scenario 3 to scenario 4.5, a 0.44 metre elevation to a 0.76 metre elevation in the levels of the ocean, that will impact 6 major airports in Australia, including Brisbane City's very own. It will inundate them. It will also fracture the M1, making it impossible to transport things from anywhere above Gympie, anywhere north of Gympie, to southeast Queensland and the rest of Australia. And it'll also fracture the Queensland rail network and the rest of Australia's rail network. Now, the Labor Party's plan to mitigate this, to mitigate these effects of climate change, actually, believe it or not, come directly from IPCC report Mitigation on Climate Change prior to they published their results. So prior to the 4th of April, the Labor Party was already on trajectory, already following the demands of the scientists, of the career scientists. We knew what was happening, and we had enacted and created a plan for it through one of our institutions, the Labor Environmental Action Network. Okay? Noting an 85% sustained reduction in solar, wind and battery technologies, the Labor Party has a plan to invest in technologies such as these. The Labor Party also is in line with the mitigation report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We support a half reductions by 2030, because that's the only way to curb the worst effects of climate change in modern Australia and in the world. I'm going to continue. Hopefully we have some interjections now. Sorry, I'll lower the microphone. No, but the Labor Party has a plan to halve the Labor Party has a plan to halve reductions by 2030. To do this, we're first going to start by initiating the public sector and legislating a net zero by 2030 in the public sector. Now, the public sector makes up 25% of the GDP, and therefore, following the public sector reaching net zero by 2030, which is what will happen under a Labor government, the private sector will soon follow after. We can demonstrate to the private sector how to do it. We'll give them the tools, the packages, the knowledge, the skills, the people. We'll make it easy and accessible. And also, whenever the public sector does something...
Max, I'll stop you right there. So, thanks for that. That's great. We'll probably cover that in more detail in question 4. But for now, I think let's keep this point on stakes, right? So what you said about the airports and the M1, right? That was stakes. So that was good stuff. Do you have any more about, you know, like what we have to consider for timelines or?
Well,
kind of
thank you for that interjection, Kyle. But in terms of the Labor Party's, in terms of what, the Labor Party does have a timeline plan. Halve reductions by 2030. Okay, by initiating a net zero in the public sector and by encouraging the residential sector and private sector to also reduce reductions, and that will guarantee a halve reductions by 2030. That's Albo's plan. And then leading up to 2050 to make sure that we're not just targeting, but we're exceeding the 2050 Paris Agreement. You know, well, that is unfortunate. I had some interesting things to say.
All right, so far, I guess, in terms of impacts, we've covered flooding from sea level rise, and we've covered agriculture. So let's see what the Greens have to bring to the table.
Excellent question. Well, firstly, these timelines, they should be informed by the extensive peer-reviewed scientific literature that is available to us, and it should be based upon a risk assessment approach according to how much incremental risk our society is willing to accept caused by climate change. So from the literature that has been collated by the IPCC, we know that human-caused global warming will have far-reaching impacts, not just to human health, but our environment, national security, and economy. We know this means more frequent, more intense heat waves, floods, droughts, tropical cyclones, bushfires. Climate change is already killing people. And between 2030 and 2050, the World Health Organization predicts that it will cause approximately 250,000 additional deaths per year. And this is relating to warming, which creates malnutrition, malaria, diarrhea, heat stress. So this puts into context the level of risks that we're looking at. And then based upon that, I guess, as I already said, international committees have agreed on 1.5 degrees global warming. So this isn't even a safe level of global warming, but it is the threshold that we've accepted to be tolerable. University College London researchers estimated in 2021 that 90% of coal must remain unextracted and oil and gas production must decline globally by 3% each year for us to maintain our 1.5 degree carbon budget. So this implies that ramping up of transitional projects must occur. They must occur now and over the next decade so that no new or proposed fossil fuel projects are viable under our already agreed upon climate commitments. I think Josh has more to say.
Thank you, Justin. I thought I'd focus on just, as Tyson was talking about, the difference between as Kyle was talking about, the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees, and the point that at this point, 1.5 is essentially irreversible, but I think I've heard a bit of discourse being around moving the goalpost to 2 degrees, and that's just not something that we can accept at this point. In hearing that 1.5 is inevitable, our next goal should be as close to 1.5 as we possibly can get. Kyle named a lot of them, but we're talking about, like twice as bad loss of plant species, extreme heat 2.6 times worse, 3.3 times worse loss of insect species, 29% worse loss of coral reefs, 10 times worse summers without sea ice in the Arctic, and even in terms of like locally, you're looking at like 1.5 degrees, high tides are reaching William McGregor Drive, and 2 degrees they're covering the sports fields. So, I think up until this point, we've had a focus on, I guess, mitigation because we were at...
Sorry, I'll interject here, just because, like, when I started talking, I constructed a timeline. I gave an envisionment to what the Labor Party's plan is to tackle climate change. Given that that's part of the question, do you reckon you could perhaps... because if Labor Party forms government, you guys are going to be essential in us getting through certain bills and what have you. So, well, I mean, I hope not. Hopefully Australians vote sensibly enough that we don't need the Greens to help pass us through. But it's the LNP that limits us from, they steal our voters and then we form these minority governments. Okay.
I'd also like to remind the audience that audience participation actually isn't encouraged for this, but thank you. You can continue if you'd like, but not.
We'd just like the Greens to construct a timeline for how they'd like things achieved. Thank you.
That's a great question.
Yeah, no worries. Well, we're here to find consensus, we're here to focus on the science, and our policies reflect the science, so we don't need to kind of yell at people at what the Labor Party are going to do. I think that we don't really need to do that, but certainly Greens policy is in line with the IPCC report. It's to reach 75% reduction in climate emissions by 2030, not 43%, which is Labor's, not 50%, I'd like to note. 43% is not particularly close to half, I don't think, but sorry.
I believe the question was considerations to establish an appropriate timeline, and that was the first sentence about the risk that is tolerable to society. But we can talk more to our 2030 targets, 2050 targets.
All right, so yes, we will go further into depth into 2030 and 2050 targets. So that is something we'll cover in question 4. But it seems like the stakes were established, especially tying off with the Greens, to say that, at least in the Greens' point of view, that 2 degrees is an unacceptable level of risk. I'd like to just confirm that because I think that was coming through in consensus. So just if you could briefly cover off on the difference between 1.5 and 2 and what is an acceptable level of risk, just briefly, LNP.
So, the main difference between 1.5 and 2, you see an increase in the severity of the stuff you see at 1.5, obviously, increasing floodwaters, stuff like that. You've talked about it before. Just increase in severity. I'd say also our ability to come back from that, to try and reduce that. Also, if we do reach 2% increase, we would need to put a lot more effort into protecting, our economy, our environment, and just putting those protections in place to make sure that, what we are experiencing is mitigated properly. Essentially that. Right,
so if you think about 2 degrees, is that something that you may accept if the costs of decarbonisation are higher than 2 degrees? You wouldn't limit us hard to 1.5 depending on the cost trade-off.
Well, of course, we're going to put the plan in place to make sure that we only get to 1.5, if circumstances, Australia only produces a fraction of global emissions. I'm not saying that isn't making us a part of the problem. We are a part of the problem, although a small one, but we can be a massive part of the solution. And I do think, I'll talk later on, that Australia has that capability to produce all of that technology and invest in the technology. We're in that prime position to be able to supply the world with, big solutions to these problems. We have the resource sector to be able to handle it. The projected increase in demand for all our resources and, our coal is increasing tremendously. Essentially that, we're in the position to make sure that we don't get to a climate change increase that is so severe that we can't come back from it, and we're making those investments to make sure that already.
Yep, I suppose a portion of it is slightly out of our control, and we'll talk about that further in question 3, but I'll bounce it back to 1.5 verse 2 at the ALP. I appreciate low temperature response.
Okay, I'll give you the response you want today. So I won't waffle on about all these policies and hoo-has, but the Labor Party finds it unacceptable to exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius in the next 2 decades, and we'll be doing everything we can in our power to mitigate and ensure correct and appropriate mitigation is done so that we do not exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius in the next 2 decades. There's your short and sweet answer.
All right, in that case, then we have somewhat of a consensus. We'll talk about question 3 now. All right, so Australia's role. Now we're going to talk about, we talked about global implications. Now we'll talk about Australia's role in that globe. So let's talk about especially these two countries which have been increasing their emissions to a point that is basically the entire world's increase. So if you look at China and India, for example, since 1990, they've represented 83% of the world's increase in emissions, and they've also represented 116% of the world's emissions since 2005. So that means all other countries combined in their decarbonisation efforts have only mitigated like 16% of the increase of China and India. And so that is basically a magnitude that we can't compare to. Australia, I think it was said before, we only emit about 1.4% of the world's direct emissions, but we do have considerable sway in our exports because we export quite a lot more than we use ourselves. And so now we really have to kind of think about, you know, we can decarbonize ourselves, and that's all well and good, but that doesn't make too much of a difference on the global scale. So how do we try, or what should we do? What is our responsibility? And to kind of even balance that with our other responsibilities. So can you go on to the next slide? Yes, so from a global perspective, what is Australia's responsibility in tackling climate change, and how should we balance that with our others? So for an example, like exporting energy to developing nations and helping them develop with that. And where would you put it into the context of the other sustainable development goals, such as, you know, access to electricity and development and all that kind of stuff. So I'll start this off with the Labor ALP.
Thank you, Kyle. So the Labor Party's perspective on this particular matter, our role is First and foremost, we don't rank particularly any particular sustainable development goal before each other. But if we did have to rank them, and if we did have to rank the 17 sustainable development goals in order, climate action would frankly not necessarily go first. SDGs relating around good health and well-being, around clean water and sanitation, come before SDGs revolving around affordable and clean energy and sustainable communities and climate action. The Labor Party's always going to put people before the environment. However, we believe a lot of these scenarios go hand in hand, and to ensure that you can have good health and well-being, you need food transported to your community. And to ensure food is transported to your community, it would be unacceptable to have sea levels rise above 0.76 metres. Therefore, we believe the Climate Action Sustainable Development Goal goes hand in hand with the Good Health and Wellbeing Sustainable Development Goal, and therefore goes with the sustainable communities, because to sustain communities, you need to ensure that climate change doesn't have that significant effect on your community. And of course, we think economic growth and jobs and industries is a huge sustainable development goal, and that's what's going to fund all of these ventures at the end of the day. So it all goes hand in hand. You can't put economical, jobs and infrastructure sustainable development goals at the end of everything, because you need a plan to pay for this, and you need to keep people employed. And frankly, the Labor Party's all about jobs and industry. We're also all about good health and well-being, and we're also about quality education, which is another sustainable development goal. So in terms of ranking these sustainable development goals, we do prioritise the ones with jobs and industry in it. We do prioritise the ones with education in it. We do prioritise the ones with health in it. However, that doesn't mean we're leaving climate action out of the picture when it comes to sustainable development goals, because climate action, sustainable communities, and clean and affordable energy goes hand in hand. Pardon me.
That's great on the sustainable development goals. Now, global perspective, how do we influence other countries?
So Australia, in influencing other countries, specifically the Indo-Pacific regions, which is what we have the direct capacity to influence on, unfortunately, the Labor Party, we don't think we're of position or of the order of magnitude to influence nations like China or India with their 2060 and 2070 goals significantly. However, we do think we can influence the regions around us. One of the private sector things that we are supporting currently is the sun energy pipeline to Singapore. So in the Northern Territory, there's a solar farm, Northern Territory, yes, somewhere south of Darwin, there's a massive solar bank. We support that solar bank ran by the private sector because unfortunately the LNP government was unable to somehow fund it themselves. So the private sector had to step in, as they always do. And they're running a pipeline from that Northern Territory region to Singapore, sustaining Singapore off quality, clean energy. Also, we encourage the transport of hydrogen, especially with Gladstone. Gladstone being a new hydrogen manufacturer in the world. We'll be exporting hydrogen, and we currently are exporting hydrogen to Japan. So that's a clean energy, zero carbon emissions there. We will, however, another thing, and I think it's important to clarify this will not be putting coal workers out of a job. Because at the end of the day, there are third world nations, and there are parts of China, and there are parts of India that do not currently have the circumstances to sustain themselves off renewable energies. So we will be keeping coal mining jobs in place, sustaining coal mining jobs to ensure that we can deliver coal to parts of the world that need it in order to prioritise the sustainable development goals of good health and wellbeing and clean water and sanitation. Because at the end of the day, in countries and parts of India, you're not going to see renewable energy schemes rolled out soon to power their hospitals. And I don't want to be the person to turn off someone's life support in favour of a renewable energy scheme.
All right, so that was great, except, so when you say that we're not going to wean off coal, we're going to continue, or we can't make too much of a difference to India and China. You saw the graphs, and you know that their targets are like 2070, or 2070 at the latest for India, and we might all be doubtful as to whether they can even make that, given what they're doing.
Correct.
That conflicts with what you said in question 2 about how 1.5 degrees is what we should avoid at all costs. So how are we supposed to go about this?
Well, first of all, if Australia is on part to exceed its 2050 goal and be net zero well before 2050, which is under, it's viable under the Labor Party plan, we would be compensating for some of what we export. However, it's not as if we have plans to sustain the coal industry forever. We just don't have plans to make people redundant in their current workplaces in the coal industry when other countries can't sustain themselves without coal. And we will be encouraging countries like India to thrive off hydrogen as opposed to coal, and build relevant plants and power stations to do that. That'll be our encouragement. We cannot enforce that. We will not cut off the tap of coal if they're not going to do that, because people will die if we do that. We do prioritise human well-being over the previous goal we suggested before. There's a priority order. Yeah. I said that.
So what does encouragement look like?
Well, encouragement looks like us being the role models, us showing them by 2030 we can have a net zero public sector. Because if we can have a net zero public sector by 2030, we can demonstrate to their government that they can do it as well. And hopefully it's things like that, small steps like that show them the way and let them find their own independent path without trying to influence them too much. At the end of the day, they are far more powerful than us, and we don't need to be fighting with our partners, our partner countries. We need to be encouraging them, pushing them, but if they can't, they won't, and they will not, then that's a responsibility above and beyond the Australian federal government. That's a responsibility that will be negotiated within the United Nations among several countries, and it's not the Australian federal government's responsibility independently, given that we have a population of 26 million and they have populations of billions.
Yeah, I see. So when it comes down to it, if we can't prevent 1.5 by just ourselves, then it'll have to go over.
It'll have to, sorry, what?
The temperature will have to go over 1.5 if we can't do anything about it, if the encouragement fails.
All I'm saying is we put people's health and well-being before climate goals.
How is not having climate goals putting people's health and well-being first?
Because we're not turning off their life support, you know?
Well,
that would be really encouraging.
we'll cut that off there for now, and we'll go over onto the Greens. Thanks.
Thank you. So, yeah, we've got a very significant role to play as a nation. We play a really large part in causing global emissions despite our small size. Obviously, it's not like China and India, but I mean, when you're looking at our levels of emissions per capita, we are 3 times China's. We beat them by a long, long way, and our coal exports are, I think, the second highest in the world. So we're very much punching above our weight when it comes to emissions, and we've got to be punching above our weight when it comes to reducing them. So I think, yeah, I agreed with a lot of what the Labor Party was saying around financing, like the, I'm not sure what it's called, the Darwin to Singapore thing. Fantastic. Yeah, I agree, totally. We definitely need to do more than that. We, for example, like foreign aid, we're going to countries which on the, only if they transition towards renewables. We are a massively wealthy country. We very much have the wealth and the ability to do that, whereas a lot of developing countries, especially talking about like China and India, just don't have that capacity. I think we need to gain a bit of empathy and realise that the level of the standard of living that we have come to appreciate and come and take for granted is something that they're trying to use an increase in emissions to get towards. And if we want to deal with this as a globe, we've got to be a leader judging by the amount that we are producing per capita. When it comes to the Sustainable Development Goals, I think I agree that you can't extract climate action from really any of the other SDGs, and it's really hard to rank them in order of what's more important. I mean, they are the most important things that we should be aiming for as a planet. But yeah, I mean, climate change very much intersects and interacts with a lot of those and contributes to humanitarian crises, especially in poor areas. We're talking about South Asia, tropical countries, island countries. These are the places which are being hardest hit and which are going to be hardest hit. And I mean, yeah, we can't look at any of the others and say that we're going to prioritise any one of the other SDGs without acknowledging that climate change functionally impacts every single one of them. So,
and I just wanted to find a point the LNP made before that we agreed with is that I guess with the whole transitioning to decarbonisation, it is an opportunity for us to bolster our domestic economy, just like how Labor said before. With hydrogen, there is a really good opportunity for Australia to lean into hydrogen production. A study into the Australian Energy Market Operators 2022 Draft Integrated System Plan says that if we can lean into renewable energies faster than predicted, we could become a hydrogen superpower in the area. And this is a highly ambitious scenario, but under this scenario, we could be producing up to 700% of our domestic energy demand by 2050, which is, a fantastic opportunity to export that energy and, support other nations in a way that doesn't rely on fossil fuels, which is, I guess, what we've only been seeing so far in the discourse.
Yeah, awesome. So I guess I'll put the same question to you guys as well. So how might we do something about this, about the massive ramping up of emissions in China and India?
yeah.
If it is even our role to do something about that.
Yeah, totally. I mean, yeah, I think it's a very hard question. That's why it's a wicked problem is, because it's really hard to deal with. It's like a tragedy or commons problem where you've got a whole bunch of different people where it's not really in their interest to do anything about it, but as a whole it is. I think, yeah, the best that we can do is subsidies for renewables in developing countries who don't have the wealth to do that like we do.
Okay. Cool. All right, in that case, then I will chuck the same question onto the Liberal National Society.
Well, so in terms of, just to give people a little bit of context, so in terms of the global perspective and our responsibility in tackling this issue, it's good to consider that Australia is roughly the 16th biggest greenhouse gas emitter. And in terms of what we emit, it's obviously not as much as what China and India emit, but I think we can come to some sort of consensus, like with what the ALP said, that we need to be the leader in this specific area. We need to be the ones that are investing in those future-proof innovations, putting more money into research, universities, and making sure that we can actually be what other countries can emulate. And in terms of our greenhouse gas emissions, it's still, it's a sliver of what other countries produce, and we're still going ahead and being that leader in the industry, making those international partnerships with all of these countries. And, frankly, we are one of the leaders in terms of making sure that we are reaching those goals. In terms of the Sustainability Development Goals of the UN, I think climate change should definitely be a lot higher than 13th. But in terms of what we are doing, investment is what's going to take us there. So yeah, that's a little bit about just the sustainability goals.
I'd just like to highlight that, obviously we aren't as big of a problem, so we should be putting ourselves in the position where our economy is suffering because of, perhaps some unrealistic climate goals. Of course, we should be punching above our weight, and we should be helping those other countries in meeting their goals as well, especially globally. But if we don't have the economy to be able to invest smart in these industries that are going to lead us to where we need to go, we're not going to make any change at all. So the economy, it should be a main priority. We can't be spending more money in areas where, it puts us in a harmful position. We can't sacrifice jobs. Something that we're especially careful about is sacrificing resource sector jobs. It's something that we just simply can't afford to do. Like I said earlier, the demand for Australia's resources continues to increase year after year. All of Australia's ores and minerals, they're going into this new technology that's being created. And Australia is at the forefront of providing that to the rest of the world. So we can't subscribe to absolutist climate policies that would put us as a sovereign state at risk at all.
I see. So it seems from all panels that Australia definitely needs to be a leader somehow. From the ALP, we got encouragement. From the Greens, we got investment. And from the LNP, we got research partnerships and investment as well. And so it seems like there's a lot of ideas coming out that are along the same lines. It's just how exactly we're supposed to be a leader. And I guess if that's enough, I suppose that's something to think about further. But at least we have consensus on the fact that we do need to lead somehow. So now we'll move on to question 4. And I have 3 slides of information to give about this one. So this is our path to decarbonisation. There's quite a lot to talk about, and this is where we do expect slight pieces of consensus somewhere, and then a lot more discussion around disagreement. So our final discussion is around this, sorry. The first is 2 very different strategies that we've actually seen presented in Australia. So first by Scott Morrison, the Australian Way plan, and then second by Zali Steggall, which is her climate bill, but was dropped in Parliament in mid-2021. So Morrison's plan is more aimed towards government investment and the progression of technology, attempting to map out where all of emissions reductions will roughly come from and how investment can help get us there. While Zali Steggall's bill is much more of a framework that doesn't bring the answers, but sets up a commission of experts and legislates requirements for ministers to find those answers and update our strategies every 5 years, similar to what has functioned in the UK for some time now. So we will have a bit of a discussion around those 2 different approaches. Then the next piece of information is, so secondly, I have this topic of carbon pricing, which I think is becoming increasingly talked about in every level of discussion, from the biggest to the smallest players in decarbonisation. And what I'll attempt to do here is dislodge the concept of a carbon tax from what is a carbon price. Because most Australians see them as the same thing. So instead, carbon pricing is just a way to assign a price on carbon, which includes a tax, but also includes a cap and trade or an emissions trading scheme, whereby a government can set caps on emissions for individual companies for them to freely emit within, but then once they exceed, they must face certain repercussions. And also those companies are free to trade the right to emit with other countries to allow that flexibility in the approach to ensure that we can actually do that, and it's not creating too much of a strain on individual companies. So that will also be a discussion point for tonight. And then Finally, I want to touch on the magnitude of the challenge. I think something I personally think is missing significantly from discussion around this topic is how much infrastructure we might actually have to build depending on how we go about it, right? So on the slide is an excerpt from the first of its kind study by Princeton University, and it's an economy-wide decarbonisation of the USA. And what you're looking at, it's a bit convoluted, there's a lot of stuff up there, but it's 6 different scenarios that they simulated as to how exactly the USA is supposed to do that. And they've used like very advanced modeling to go through that. And so on the rightmost scenario in there where it says E plus, RE plus, is where they've said that society and industry in the USA would be highly electrified to cut emissions and that only renewable energy will be used for electricity. Then what they've actually graphed here in this graph is deployment of renewable infrastructure. And what you can see is it compares, or it shows a ramp up because you can't just like instantly go ham on your infrastructure. You have to ramp up. But it shows that if you do that ramp up and you do it like quite fast, considering everything, the final 5 years of that like 2045 to 2050 to get to net zero, just the USA would have to deploy renewable energy infrastructure 1.5 times faster than the entire world ever has to this point. And so that also, well, that can be compared to the other one of the E plus, RE minus, where renewable energy deployment is capped at a certain point, and other things such as carbon sequestration and nuclear is allowed to be deployed. And even in that point, nuclear has to be deployed 2.5 times faster than the US has ever deployed nuclear so far. So then, I mean, that's all the USA. It doesn't really help context for this discussion in particular. However, there is a study being done for Australia. It's just not ready yet. But the magnitude that we are seeing is similar. And so stuff like, you know, it might take 13 times our current electricity peak generation on the grid, running 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, just to make the current hydrogen from green infrastructure that we use. So like that's going towards ammonia for fertilizer, and that's going towards industry. So we would have to build 13 times our grid infrastructure just to decarbonize a small part of like fertilization. And nothing in terms of our exports, nothing in terms of our transport and all this kind of stuff that hydrogen is usually hyped up to be this amazing thing. All those values that I just spat out for Australian hydrogen is using the current efficiency. So we're guaranteed for that to be lower than what I just said because we will make technological advancements. It's just a question of how fast we can do that and how fast we can deploy it, because that is just a small part of the economy. And when we look at the whole scale, or like the entire economy, we're looking at, if we try to go purely renewable, all of our exports going hydrogen, we're looking at like 80 times our current capacity of the grid. And so we would have to increase our current deployment by an average of 30 times every year from now until 2070. And so when you think about that kind of scale, it's almost crushing initially, and it seems to put everything in perspective of like, how fast can we actually deploy this infrastructure? How fast can we research it to make sure that it's actually, you know, viable? How fast can we, or like how much money has to go into it to deploy it at a point where it's not commercially viable until it can become that point? And so these are all the things that I've been putting to these panelists, and it's quite a tough challenge. It's definitely not something that's easy to talk about and to figure out, especially as students, but I've found that they've tried pretty hard, and so it's worth hearing them out. So the questions that I have for this final one is, if 2050 is the goal for net zero, how can we be sure that we'll reach that? What should our 2030 goal be? What are your thoughts on the Zali-Steggall's climate bill, and how does it compare to Scott Morrison's bill? What should the government's role be in decarbonisation, and do we need a carbon price to get there? And are you aware of what it might take to go net zero domestically and across Australia's exports? Therefore, what is the ideal energy mix? So we've allotted 7 minutes for each club, 3 of those minutes being under immunity. So I'll put this first to the Liberal National Society.
Yeah, so in terms of 2050 being our goal, how we will reach that is through continuing that investment in emissions technologies. And that's obviously going to happen through the next 30 years. It's not going to be something that, just happens overnight. It takes many, many years for it to actually become a system that can take us to the future. And in terms of what Labor and the Greens think in terms of how we're going to do this, they always come from this perspective that, we can just snap our fingers and make this change overnight. But we see the change as something that has to be very, it's going to take many, many years, and we won't actually see the final result until very close to 2050. In terms of exactly how we will do this, lots of investment has already gone into the expanding of the electricity market and investing in things like more battery power technology, which is something that Australia has the capacity to do. This technology will be implemented to expand our national electricity market so that we can actually deal with these changes that are going to impact our economy for years to come. And we've also been looking at things like methane emissions in agriculture specifically. So, it's not all about CO2. There are other things that you have to consider. Direct air carbon capture and storage is also something that we are looking at investing in, and just increasing our kind of portfolio in that way. So that's sort of how we will get there. In terms of the differences between Zali-Steggall's bills and our plan is, as you said, Kyle, so Zali-Steggall's bill is basically just a framework. It's something that's there to legislate just for Australia. It doesn't really consider the massive impact that this is going to have on our economy. It's not going to, this is going to impact household costs. It's going to impact people's everyday lives. And, just looking at it from the goal that she brings forward for 2030, which is the 60% reduction, it's just incredibly shocking. Like, how can we get to that point where we can achieve something like that, where, you haven't even considered how you're going to invest in these technologies to get them ready? And that's why we think that Scott Morrison's plan is the one to continue with, because, it's not going to just give us a framework, it's actually going to give us a long-term vision. It's technology and not taxes, no more mandates.
Just a slight interjection.
Yeah.
You referred to the Labor Party and the Greens as we have a plan that snap our fingers and change overnight. If you could elaborate on that, because I actually think we have quite a good plan. We have a whole committee dedicated to forming that plan. If you could discuss what brought you to say that.
So in terms of a lot of the things that are said in the media, it's always something that's brought up by Labor and the Greens that we haven't really thought through this process, and it's just sort of something that, we're not really putting that much effort into investing, and we're just leaving it all to the private sector. But it's actually something that has taken years of experience of getting to know Australia's unique economy, which, is based very heavily on the coal industry. And I think in terms of where we're going forward, that's something to consider. And it's not something that I think the Greens and Labor really understand realistically. So.
Just to add a little bit more context, I think it would be helpful to know what our current, what our current emissions reduction has been so far. So we've currently limited our emissions or reduced it by 20% since 2005 levels. But all of that basically has been land use change and forestry. So basically just changing the way we do land and building a whole bunch of forests. So any kind of wind turbine farm or solar farm that you've seen put out, all of that kind of like limiting of the electricity emissions, we've cut down on 17% of those, but in every other sector across the board, we've basically been increasing. So industry, all of this kind of stationary energy for industry, waste, fugitive emissions, all that kind of stuff has increased to completely offset that. And so really, if you take out land use change, we've only decreased by 1%. And so it would be helpful to know that when we talk about how fast we can decarbonize and to what level we can decarbonize by 2030, because that's only 8 years away and we've currently had 16 years to do that across the other things. So I think that would be a very helpful context for the rest of the discussion, unless anyone else would like to ask the Liberal National Society any more questions. Okay, cool. I'll chuck it to the Greens then. So same question.
I'll just talk to the 2050 and 2030. So how can we be sure that we'll reach this goal? One simple thing everyone could do is to vote for political candidates with the best climate policies. In terms of the practicality of reaching net zero within the next couple of decades, the IPCC Working Group 2 report highlights the importance of climate resilient development, and essentially these goals, we'll only be able to reach them with cooperation from across international bodies, governments of all levels, education, science institutions, media, investors, businesses, and traditionally marginalised groups. And speaking about in Australia, our efforts to decarbonise should be centred around the fossil fuel workforce and towns that would see the most impact from decarbonisation. Because without a plan which puts the people and communities first and ensures financial sanity for these people, we can almost guarantee that any planned move away from fossil fuels would flop. I think talking to one of the points ALP made before, there is actually a case study in Germany. They did use a generous financial support package to support coal workers to move away from this industry, and they were able to approach into new markets without losing any jobs. So it is definitely achievable. About 2030 goals, our goals should aim to delay when we hit 1.5 degrees global warming. In the unfortunate case that we pass that, it is important to note that we need to hit net zero by 2050 globally, but looking to Australia specifically, there has been research done by the University of Melbourne, and for Australia to contribute its fair share to limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees in line with Paris, Australia would have to reach 74% below 2005 levels by 2030, with net zero emissions reached by 2035. For Australia to be compliant with even 2 degrees global warming, we would still need to reduce emissions by 50% by 2005, 50% by 2030 compared to 2005. Alternatively, if Australia persists with its current target, which is 26% by 2030, and if we still want to maintain 2 degrees, it creates a really difficult situation where you've got to catch up for a much larger amount of ground in a condensed amount of time. You'd have to see a tenfold increase in the amount of effort after 2030 compared to the amount of effort we would have put in before 2030. So I guess the Greens 2030 goal is 75% by 2030, in line with all this information. And I think we think that adopting a 2030 domestic target weaker than this would require our society to accept the risks associated with global warming well above 1.5 degrees. Anything to add?
Yeah, looking at like Steggles and the coalition's plans, I think it's important to note that they're quite different in the goals that they've got. Steggles is very much a framework from which specific plans could be formulated, whereas the coalition's is by necessity a specific plan. I think, yeah, and Steggles, yeah, like Kyle was saying, is an approach similar to what the UK committed to over a decade ago. And for the UK, that's seen a 44% reduction to greenhouse gas emissions compared to 1990 levels. It's had demonstrated benefits for their economy and on emissions reductions. So, yeah, I think very much we can take their lead. They're leaps and bounds ahead of us on climate policy at the moment. But it's important to keep in mind that when they were legislating that over a decade ago was a very different time in climate policy. If we were to legislate Steggles bill now, we would have to act on it very, very quickly and use that as a foundation extremely quickly for that to see any kind of impact. I think like the 7 key guiding principles behind Steggles bill are, like effective action, informed decision making, fiscal responsibility, community engagement. They're all good things. I don't think it seems like a particularly controversial bill, frankly. Yeah. When it comes to, what's next? Oh yeah, so looking at, what's the government's role in decarbonisation? I think, our climate policy has to be consistent with our commitment to the Paris Agreement, which is attempting as best as we can to get it to as close to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels as we can, and the responsibility for that falls pretty squarely in the hands of the government. The free market neoliberal logic have not succeeded in doing that at all as of yet. The only effective period of climate policy Australia's ever had was under the Gillard government supported by the Greens, which was the ETS. Emissions due to electricity generation fell to a 10-year low, and there was a reduction of 17 million tonnes of CO2 in that time. Essentially our step forward should be to legislate a carbon price again so that we can get back on the right track, but we need to do it very, very quick, because at that point in time it looked possible for us to hit 1.5. Obviously it's not now, but yes, we should legislate that again.
Awesome. I guess we failed to cover carbon pricing or government's role in Liberal National Society, so I'll just throw it back to you guys. So I think Liberal National Society is conventionally against a carbon tax, but what are your thoughts on a cap and trade kind of system?
Look, the government is in favour of an ETS, although it would not be as high as what the Labor Party, what the Greens would propose. What we are against is a carbon tax. Taxes of any form, they just end up hindering business. It's true. If a business gets taxed so much that they don't want to do business in Australia, none of that money is coming back into our economy. That's just a simple fact. You can't tax the hell out of people and expect them to still want to do business in your country. It's just common sense. But no, an ETS, we're not going to reach net zero 2050 without some form of an ETS. It's a simple fact. All the reports, are in favour of it, and that's something that the government is in favour of as well. I believe it's something like $23 a tonne of an ETS. You'd see parties that oppose us push it up much higher. You'd see them try to hinder business more. We are a party that is dedicated to supporting the economy first and foremost, because the economy is what allows us to be able to drive social change and ensure that we are in a position to punch above our weight with things like leading the charge in climate action.
All right, so $23 was the price named by Liberal National. Do the Greens know the price that you would prefer, or if not, it's fine? No, Labor, I'd like to put this question to you, but also if you could start with the carbon pricing and if there is a price that you prefer.
The federal Labor has not announced any sort of concrete pricing on carbon tax, but there is a mechanism in the Powering Australia policy to have the Climate Change Commission to impose some sort of mechanism to dissuade big polluters, big emission entities. But I think it's quite obvious that we need some sort of mechanism, if that's an ETS or if that's a carbon tax or a carbon price, whatever you want to call it, there needs to be some sort of mechanism to dissuade emissions, greenhouse emissions, because that's the whole end of trying to combat climate change. We need to get rid of it, and through technology is not fast enough at the moment, so there needs to be some other mechanism. But in terms of answering the other questions, like what's our roadmap to 2050 for net zero and our 2030 goals, there are 3 key areas that we really need to consider when decarbonising. First one is the electricity grid, then we need to consider transport, and we need to consider exports. In terms of the electricity grid, Federal Labor's plan, if in government, is to get 43% reduction by 2030, and this will mean we'll have a renewable energy penetration in the electricity grid of 82%, which is pretty good. And this can be effectively done with wind and solar, coupled with batteries, which at the moment is the cheapest form of new energy generation. However, renewables still suffer from not dispatchability issues, but variability issues. So that means right now the Australian Energy Market Operator has suggested and has released blueprints to upgrade the energy the national energy market to be able to sustain more renewables in the transmission. And this means a $20 billion urgent investment that's needed, and Labor has committed themselves to that. In terms of transportation, at the moment, Australian consumers are really starved for options in terms of EVs. At the moment, it's 1% of all sales for vehicles in Australia are electric. That's compared to 15% in the UK or 75% in Norway. And that's mainly because we don't really have enough choices. There's only 30 choices for electric vehicles, and only 5 of them are under actually 60 grand, which is the only ones that are really viable, while the UK has 130 options and 30 models under 60 grand. And to mitigate that, we need to remove tariffs, import tariffs, which are 5%, and remove the 47% tax on electric vehicles that are used for personal use and bought through company. In terms of that, we also need to start a second-hand market for electric vehicles that brings prices down and people are able to use them. So we've committed to a 75%. We've committed to changing the Commonwealth fleet to a 75% electric vehicle fleet. And that's great because, 2/3 of Australians are willing to buy an electric vehicle at the moment. What our main issue and our main electric transportation and electricity is viable. Our main challenge in terms of how we pollute in Australia will be exporting and the export of coal. And I don't think, as we've talked about previously, it's not viable to just ban exports of coal because that's unfair to countries that are going through the development process. We need to focus on providing cleaner and cheap options, which then will make it viable for developing nations and any other coal consumers to want to take in hydrogen or just connect directly to the grid. You've seen it, like we mentioned before, Sun Cable. Singapore wants direct electricity from our solar power, and they also want, also Japan has committed to buying hydrogen from us for the next few decades. I think it's a no-brainer. In terms of Sally Steagall's plan, I think it's pretty good in that you have a 10 yearly reviews, and it's actually legislated, so you actually have to follow it, and that will just end a bit of all the politicization in terms of just climate change in general. I think everyone's kind of sick and tired for the last decade how much bickering has been going on, and really do need actually some more consensus, not just here, but in Parliament itself. If we can legislate that target, I think it'll be good to have because that makes it a bit more untouchable. In terms of answering, what was it? What's the ideal energy mix? I think I've answered that already with 82% renewable penetration by 2030. That's key, and we should be aiming higher. That's a goal. That doesn't mean we can get there any earlier.
Yep. And so I guess with reference to what I said in the beginning about how, or the magnitude that we might be looking at if we try to go fully renewable and we try to go fully hydrogen for our exports, what are your considerations around that? Do you have faith that it will decrease to a point where that'll actually be 80 times less? Or do you think that more may be needed than just renewable energy on the electricity grid?
It's hard to tell because with a lot of these new technologies, we've seen it with through industrialization, through the technology over the last 30 years, it expands exponentially. So it's hard to tell when, and it expands exponentially in terms of how efficient you are to make it, so then prices come down. But I'm very confident that once we get the ball rolling, and hopefully we have a Labor government in, and we actually can put these policies through, and we start actually showing good example and putting research into all these areas, especially the hydrogen that's being developed right now in Queensland State Government alongside Fortescue Future Industries, and also looking into green steel. Those are main areas because much of our coal is metallurgical coal, and at the moment we have no other alternative to make steel other than with coal. So I think those are some really key areas that you just need to get the ball rolling, and hopefully prices come down.
All right, so starting the ball rolling and having hope. So Liberal National Society, more on this, what it may take and ideal energy mix, what are your thoughts?
Solar, wind and hydrogen, obviously the big contenders in what we should be investing in heavily going forward. I also think that, the debate around nuclear power should be started more. I think it should be started more, especially these, brand new nuclear technology that's coming out. It's clean, it's efficient, it's safe. I see, Australia does have the capability, either to build those plants or invest in them and see whether they're feasible for Australia or not. There's lots of potential in hydrogen as well, as we've discussed. The coalition are building 3 of the world's largest hydrogen electrolyzers, so we're taking those steps to make sure that we have those different viable energy options. But I really would like to place the focus on looking more into nuclear power. I think it's something that could really help us a lot in our energy mix, especially as we're going to have to continue to produce metallurgical coal. There's always going to be a demand for coal no matter what we do. So as long as we have that capability to produce clean energy and produce coal and also have those carbon drawback schemes to make sure that, overall our emissions are either zero or negative. But like I said, solar, wind, hydrogen and nuclear. You've seen with Australian solar technology, I believe it's something like 90% of solar technology worldwide uses Australian technology. So that's an industry that we're leading in, and we're going to continue to invest in those so that we can be world leaders in more than just solar.
Yeah, great. Now that nuclear has been raised, I think I might just provide a little bit more context as to what that new technology you were talking about was. So with nuclear, there's been new designs are coming out called small modular reactors, and there's a specific design that has been recently approved in the USA, which a recent study by a professor at UQ has found that these kind of reactors can be deployed between 3 and 5 years. Construction time, they can be done for between $4.4 and $8.8 billion, and they take roughly the exact same workforce as a coal plant, and also they have a much smaller kind of emergency planning zone than a regular nuclear power plant was. And so conventionally, I think the debate is usually around cost and time it takes to build, and safety as well. And so I'd like to start this kind of discussion around nuclear a little bit, first going to the Greens and then the Labor around this and how considerations may change with this new technology.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think definitely the problem that the Greens have had with nuclear in the past has been very much around the amount of time that it takes to implement and get those nuclear plants functional. That in the past it has been at a point where it would not have, and it would have been past the point of no return with the actual impact on emissions. So I guess with this new technology, I think it is obviously new and developing. So it's not. I think first, we need to have, I guess, a point of information for the public and for policymakers, and then I guess detailed feasibility studies around it before we dive into it. But definitely very promising compared to I guess where we were before with nuclear.
And I guess touching on that UQ report, one of the key findings was that nuclear energy could never be deployed in Australia without first building that public trust with the community through thoughtful discussion and listening. So I guess before anyone could throw any support, there would have to be that sort of roundtable sort of community consultation.
Cool. And now to the ALP.
The ALP has been historically very much anti-nuclear, and it's still part of a national platform. So there's no chance anytime soon that Labor is going to change. But there's always very much internal debates, and there's some key players in there with support for it. And I think the public opinion can definitely change with these small modular reactors, but I don't think it's going to be Australia testing those first. If you see them in other countries and just build trust there in the community and then they want it, I think then there's a chance of the ALP changing its course.
Okay, cool. So I guess that's a very, very tentative potential consensus on nuclear, but yet to see and many years away. So finally, I guess, a little bit more nitpicking, I guess, into the individual goals. So 2030 goals, pulling us back to that, just finally. So the differences are Liberal National Party is going for a 26 to 28 degree decrease by 2030. ALP is going for a 46. Is that correct? 43. So 43. Zali Steggles was aiming for a 60% and Greens are aiming for a 75%. So I guess they were all laid out on the table. It's just a lot of considerations about how fast we can get there by 2030, or like the harm of setting too high or too low of a target, what we can actually do. But then also once we get there, how fast we have to deploy things afterwards, after that point. I think it's still more things to walk away and think about. I just wanted to throw back to the Liberal National Society. I think the Scott Morrison's plan pledged $20 billion in funding. I'd like you to just justify that amount of money and kind of paint a picture of like what that can actually do.
Sure. So to start off with, a lot of that is going into the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, and a lot of these investment mechanisms that go directly into businesses. And, you know, we can already see a lot of that investment that's going in because, you know, you have all of these new innovations that are coming out of our country that, you know, we've never seen before in any other countries before. And a lot of that investment is something that, you know, it's kind of just the beginning of it. It's not meant to be an overarching investment that's going to ensure that the government will necessarily get us to that 2050 goal. It's there to allow the proliferation of these innovations. It's there to ensure that we can actually move forward, have a great portfolio of different innovations that can lead us to that goal, but it's not just meant to be, you know, throwing money at something and expecting it to, expecting the public money to fix the issue.
Yeah, okay. And I guess paired with an emissions trading scheme, it's in your opinion that that would be enough to make it to 2050?
Yeah, private industry has shown us time and time again that they're willing to independently take the steps to advance themselves, whether it's in terms of a climate target from consumer pressure. You know, we've seen time and time again that a lot of private industries don't need government pressure to be able to succeed. As soon as governments start interfering, things start going wrong. So I think that, you know, the Australian government making those investments in key areas to help make sure that those industries can innovate by themselves. That is how we're going to get there, not by government intervention, not by increasing taxes. We're going to get there on the back of, you know, everyday hardworking Australians. We're going to get there on the back of small and medium-sized businesses, as well as those big corporations that are already leading the charge in getting net zero, you know, within their business and overall. You look at mining companies. You know, they've got plans already from consumer pressure to make sure that after they leave, the environment's rehabilitated. They've got plans to support the communities around them while they're there, you know, completing their operations. I've lived in towns where the local mining company has paid for new classrooms, have paid for, you know, ovals to be returfed. So they already have the plans to be able to put in place to reach that independent of government. Government does not always have the answers to everything, and I think that everybody knows that.
How do you respond to like the Business Council of Australia, the Farmers Federation, the Australian Responsible Investment Centre asking for legislated net zero targets by 2030 and 2050 for some actual like certainty in how they can invest? When they're screening for this sort of certainty, how do you then say the government, they don't need anything, the government shouldn't be intervening?
I think to some extent, you know, some things may be able to be legislated without having... No, some things. But you see, the majority of what is going to get done is by private industry. You know, we don't need to be legislating everything away. We don't need to legislate every moral right and wrong. We know what works and what doesn't. We need to let the market do its thing. Some bodies may seem that it may be beneficial for private industry for their goals to be legislated. But at the end of the day, a lot of legislation in the hands of the wrong people does much more harm than it does good. So if you just have a very smart investment roadmap, you have a plan that's flexible, that can adjust to changing circumstances, you end up with a better outcome.
Yeah, if I just may, I don't think we can let Australia's largest polluters determine when it is convenient for them to decarbonise. It's really one of the roles that the government has to take, especially since it's internationally it's recognised as one of the most important sustainable development goals. Even in Australia currently, there are 114 new coal and gas projects on our government's register, supported by both major parties. And these projects, if completed, will release more than double our current domestic carbon emissions. And these sort of actions that we're seeing aren't really consistent with the Paris agreements that we've already agreed to.
Yep. All right. Well, in that case, I think I'll wrap up the discussion. It was a very, very short time and it didn't do enough justice to this topic, but I guess you never can, especially in an hour and a half when we've already gone over the hour mark. So I guess just to wrap up on question one, we kind of covered climate change being a human cause. I think consensus was pretty clear across the board. On question two, we looked at like the impacts and what are the stakes. And so we kind of agreed that 1.5 was the goal, at least that was clear from Greens and ALP. And that 2 degrees is quite bad and that we might not want to be there. Then we went on to question 3, and that was quite a challenging topic, thinking about how we might influence other countries. All parties agreed that we need to be a leader somehow. It's just how do we actually do that, whether it's through encouragement, investment, partnership, research. I suppose it would be best to do all of those. It's just like painting a picture of how and exactly how to do that. But the fact that we do need to be a leader was very prominent. And then finally, we got into the path to decarbonisation, what this country is actually supposed to do to decarbonise our domestic emissions. And so we looked at 4 very unique targets, which are still really quite uncontested on their own, and we don't really know where to sit with those, and I think that's fair. I mean, we're all students, and none of us really are sitting behind doing all the maths to figure out how fast we can do anything. But we did all agree that emissions trading schemes is the way to go, because I suppose it would be a little bit too risky to let everyone just go about and do this themselves, and to provide that assurance that things are actually going to be done. I think that's quite a success for consensus, or at least as far as it can go, less than a month out from a federal election. So I think it's been a good job, thrilling in some parts and okay in some parts. So I'd just like to thank all panelists for coming together, doing all the homework, and actually agreeing to do this. I think it was quite a significant achievement even to get them in the room. And to have the discussion and somewhat consensus that we did manage to find on all questions was a massive benefit. So thank you.